This video will explore Attitude Online magazine, one of the set texts for EDUCAS Media Studies A-Level, from an industry's perspective, because the guidance for 2022 exams has informed us that attitude will be an industry's question. It poses some problems because this is one of the texts which is perhaps hardest to explore from an industry's perspective. And for that reason, I'm going to try to look at the text through the lens of two of our industry theorists, Curran and Seaton and David Hesmonhalgh, and I'll look at Livingston and London regulation in a separate video. And really what I would encourage you to do, and what I'm going to try and do in this video, is to think about how these theorists would respond. To what extent does attitude as a product, as a text, as a brand, support Curran and Seaton's ideas, or support Hesmonhalgh's ideas, or indeed to challenge them and consider in what ways might the theories be problematic when applying them to attitude. That's really going to be your job in component 2, is being evaluative and to challenge ideas and look at alternative perspectives, and that's what we're going to try and do here. Let's think about Curran and Seaton first then, and they have two strands really to the theory that is put forward in the A-level specification. The first one is the idea that the media is controlled by a small number of companies, primarily driven by the logic of profit and power, and that where you have media concentration, you generally have a dearth of variety, creativity, and quality. And then there's a second strand which really just follows on. It's essentially the same point, but from another angle. The idea that more socially diverse patterns of ownership therefore help to create the conditions for more varied and adventurous media productions. I read lots of student essays which say that because, let's say I, Daniel Blake, for example, as a text, because I, Daniel Blake is distributed by and produced by an independent company, it challenges Curran and Seaton's theory that the media is controlled by a small number of companies. Well, it doesn't. It supports the second strand. Because I, Daniel Blake, is independent, it is therefore a more socially diverse pattern of ownership, and it is a more varied and adventurous production. The only text I can think of in the specification really that challenges Curran and Seaton's theory is Black Panther, because Black Panther is conglomerate controlled, is produced by Disney, Marvel, but it is more varied and adventurous because of its very nature. It's the only text I can think of in the specification really that does challenge it. And attitude certainly supports that second strand. More socially diverse patterns of ownership lead to more varied and adventurous productions. If we consider the way in which LGBT characters and representations have been constructed by the mainstream media over time, we'll see the importance that attitude plays, the important role that it plays in addressing those misrepresentations and underrepresentations. An article here in The Guardian talks about Hollywood being criticised for negative portrayals of LGBT characters. Larry Gross in 1991 talks about, for the most part, gay people have been simply invisible in the media. Mostly they are ignored or denied, symbolically annihilated. When they do appear, they do so in order to play a supportive role for the natural order and are thus narrowly and negatively stereotyped. So over time, certainly in the 70s, 80s and 90s, we had a very, very narrow view of homosexual identity. They were stereotyped in a certain way that was perhaps driven by a fear of difference, and quite often minority groups are stereotyped in order to reduce them so that hierarchies and structures of power can be maintained. And that's really what Larry Gross is talking about here. The mainstream media, the conglomerate-owned media, powerful media industries had annihilated gay identity in the media. That would seem to support Cohen. Sander de Ridler et al. In 2011 said the right to be visible, acknowledged and in this way legitimised is indispensable for social change. Therefore, media representations of gay and lesbian identities in popular culture are crucial. And this is where attitude comes in. Because as an independent company, attitude is part of that socially diverse patterns of ownership that Cohen and Seaton talk about. It's published by Stream Publishing, and as an independent publisher, they're a large company. They also publish Rolling Stone magazine, but they are independent, and as an independent publisher they have the freedom to target niche audiences, and in this case that's gay men and the LGBTQ+ community. They also have the freedom to be driven by societal change rather than profit and power. They therefore also have the freedom to be subversive, to challenge popular ideology, to be controversial, and we're going to consider the extent to which they satisfy that brief now. So are they more varied, as Cohen and Seaton would put it? In lots of ways, I think we have to argue, yes, they are, because if we consider what Larry Gross was saying, that gay identity was essentially annihilated in the mainstream media, it was reduced to an extent or removed to an extent that there were just no legitimate gay identities within the media, or where they were very narrow in terms of their stereotyping. Attitude as a product offers a much more diverse range of gay identities. If we just look at these two recent stories here, first of all, we have a black gay man and a white gay man here in Lil Nas X and Tom Daley. We also have very, very different representations of what it means to be a gay man. We're breaking down stereotypes. Tom Daley, in many ways in these images, might be considered to be stereotypically gay, as Larry Gross might argue. But Lil Nas X offers a very, very different perspective. And so we are getting a much greater range of gay identity through attitude. And someone like Gauntlet would argue that that greater range of identities enables readers and users to construct their own identities, for their identities to become legitimized. They no longer have to feel entirely annihilated or reduced or utterly stereotyped, and attitude provides the platform for that opportunity. Is attitude more adventurous? Well, I think you only have to look at the boys page on a weekly basis to realise that yes, attitude is much more adventurous than a product, a mainstream product, a conglomerately owned product that we might have seen in the past. The kind of images that we see here would have been considered shocking even 25 years ago in the mainstream media. Yet attitude has provided a space for such images, such identities to be not just acceptable, but to become mainstream. And that's important in terms of legitimizing gay identity. So I think we have to argue that Cohen and Seaton's theory is very much supported here. This is a more diverse pattern of ownership. It's an independently published magazine, and it does offer a much greater range of identities and much more adventurous and what would have been in the past seen as controversial topic matter. And that brings us on to David Hesmonhalgh, and we're going to look at the two different strands that Hesmonhalgh's theory gives us. The first one is that cultural industry companies try to minimize risk and maximize audiences through vertical and horizontal integration and by formatting their cultural products through the use of styles, genres and serials. And the second one, the idea that the radical potential of the internet has been contained to some extent by its partial incorporation into a large profit-orientated set of cultural industries. Well, let's consider the first strand first, this idea that companies minimize risk and maximize profit through vertical and horizontal integration and through formatting of products. Is this true of Attitude? Well, in many ways it is. First of all, although it's an online magazine and print magazine, it is vertically integrated to an extent because it has the Attitude Awards and the Attitude Pride Awards, which diversifies its product, which broadens its appeal, which reaches greater, broader and more diverse audiences. So in that way they are minimizing risk. And we could also argue that they minimize risk through the use of stars, as Hesmond Howells would put it. They feature people like Stephen Fry, like Tom Daley. They cover stories about popular culture, such as RuPaul's Drag Race UK. So in many ways, they're formatting their products also to minimize risk and reach broader audiences and further their appeal. The danger of this, of course, is that Attitude becomes a more mainstream product. In many ways, that's a good thing because we're getting a broader range of identities reaching a larger audience. That has to be considered a positive, and that's really what Attitude is set up to do. But the second strand of Hesmond Howells' theory throws up a slight problem in that regard, and we have to consider that perspective here. Because he also argues that the radical potential of the internet has been partially contained by its incorporation into a profit-orientated set of cultural industries. So the argument might be, and you have to consider this argument, that by becoming more mainstream, Attitude loses its edge. It loses its radical potential, as Hesmond Howells puts it. It loses its subversive quality. It loses its potential to be controversial, to challenge mainstream ideology. But if we look at Attitude and look at its website, whilst the introduction of stars might be seen to be less radical, it is still challenging prejudice and bigotry and conservative views on a daily basis. At the top here, we have the 10 breathtaking pictures of models and dancers striking a pose in diamonds. Images which 20 years ago would have been considered controversial would not have found a place in mainstream media. So it is challenging perceptions of what is acceptable to a mainstream audience. It is pushing the boundaries in that regard. And if we look at 3 of the stories, which are from today, you only have to go on to Attitude on a daily basis and you'll find these stories, 4 stories in fact. We have the Florida Senate passes Don't Say Gay bill in horrific step backwards. This is a story about a law which is being passed in Florida to say that at primary school issues of homosexuality cannot be taught. Joe Biden has completely condemned this. We've got a story here about a gay basketball fan who's uncovered shocking homophobic tweets from 36 professional NBA players, again exposing prejudice within a mainstream sport. And further than that, Attitude not only does that in Western nations, but it does it globally. It challenges prejudice globally. It is a global brand. We've got gay Afghans stabbed in Taliban attack left feeling hopeless. And we've got Singapore court refuses to overturn anti-gay law criminalising homosexuality. They are not only challenging prejudice, but they are providing a voice to the voiceless, particularly in societies where homosexuality is still illegal, where homosexuality is still outlawed. And it gives a voice to those people. It allows them to feel part of a community. It is therefore subversive, it is therefore challenging, and it is therefore still radical. So to a large degree, I think that attitude in many ways challenges that second strand of Hessenhalger's theory. Yes, it is becoming more mainstream, but in doing that, it doesn't appear to be losing its radical, controversial, and subversive edge.